And it creates a disconnect, which is uncomfortable, which is not only uncomfortable, but Frank and I contend it's dangerous for the country because it can lead you to use your military unwisely. What we contend is we've brought ourselves to a position where the deciders don't know what it is that the doers do. So how can you decide well? And in many ways, so many of our civilians don't understand that they are the deciders. We heard a beautiful presentation on Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Well, you all are the deciders. The civilians are the deciders about that law. The military obeys laws. When that law is changed, the military will obey it. To me, it's, to use a Yiddish word, a shanda, a shame that some young privileged people might go to a 25-year-old sergeant's recruit station and interfere with his ability to do his required job when he has no power there, when the power rests in your hands, not in the military hands. And but it's that confusion that comes from the disconnect that I think leads to some of the problems and allows people, at least on the military side, to experience that assault upon dignity that Donna Hicks discussed. So reconciliation is a good word in the sense that we need to reestablish the bonds between leaders and those who serve. And for the leaders to really recognize and own the fact that these are people who serve them and they have a certain level of responsibility. We have a certain level of responsibility for each other. I think this particularly, to me, this matters because I'm married to someone who serves. Before I had very little interest in connection to the military. I grew up in an upper middle class suburb. My father's a Jewish psychiatrist. I went to Bryn Mawr and Princeton. I worked in Democratic politics. I worked in the Clinton White House. And I didn't know the difference between the Air Force and the Army and the Marine Corps and the Navy. I didn't know the difference between a sergeant and a lieutenant colonel. But I had gotten, yeah, exactly. But I had gotten a master's in international affairs from Princeton. And somehow it seemed like you could do that in this day and age and not know those things. And I furthermore thought that there was something good about our society that I didn't need to know those things, that somehow was a positive statement as opposed to something different. And I now think differently. I think that we need, I learned what it is that the military does. I learned the range of missions that we do around the world. I know, unlike many people who, many of the civilians, that we have 200,000 military deployed around the world, not in Afghanistan or Iraq, that we have a range of missions that run from stabilization to peacekeeping to humanitarian affairs to bolstering other countries' militaries, because I have a personal connection, and when you care, you learn. And it's our civilians that send our military to do that, yet it's the same civilians who also don't know that we are sending them to do that. So that disconnect prevents us from providing the kind of support that we need to have there. So we need civilian control of the military in order to have a stable democracy. And we need to use our military in a moral way. And the only way that will happen is if the civilians are engaged enough and invested enough to understand what the military does, to know how it can and can't be used, and to lead properly. Harvard was one of the founding forces in the ROTC movement in the turn of the 20th century. Harvard and a number of other organizations, a number of other institutions such as Cornell recognized that America was on the verge of becoming a world power. And they recognized that our military was going to be more and more influential and important around the world and abroad. And they demanded that we train a proportion, a healthy proportion, a majority, in fact, of our officers in the civilian institutions so that we could imbue our military officers with the values of the civilian world. And they argued that if we only educate these folks in military academies, we'll have a separate caste. It's not what the founders had in mind, and it won't allow us to be the kind of country we want to be. I find it extremely ironic that Harvard is among the institutions that's most stubborn in keeping the military out now, and using the excuse of don't ask, don't tell, which I contend it's an excuse because logically it doesn't follow that the military has the power to change that law. I think it's a convenient excuse to keep it out, instead of owning the responsibility of the military and owning the responsibility for sending the best possible people we can into the military. I want the largest pool of people possible, the largest pool of qualified people to serve so that we can have the best military possible to keep the people who we know and love safe and to do the work that we need to do around the world with good judgment. And I think everyone here would agree. I would just close with a story of a lunch that I had a few years back with people I knew from the Clinton administration. It was a wealthy gentleman who had been the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Humanitarian Affairs and his wife, and we were having lunch at a Beverly Hills restaurant and chatting about things. And the wife was explaining to me how passionately she felt about Darfur and how she really thought we needed to send troops in there, troops in the ground to stop the genocide. And I knew she had college-age children, so I said, would you send your sons to Darfur to do that? And she said, I would send my sons to Darfur, but I could never trust the government to only use my children the way I would want them to be used, so I would never let them join the military. So I asked her, whose sons would you like to send to Darfur then? Because if they're not our children, whose children are they? If these are things we're all willing to be invested in, then what kind of a country are we going to be? So I'm glad that we're having this discussion. I hope we continue to move it forward, and I hope we understand how high the stakes are for those of the people who serve in the military and for our country as a whole. Thank you.